constantly to invest in the armed forces, to think of the changes on the ground and prepare them for the new challenges. Let me now focus on the international landscape. So I mentioned that there were two centers of gravity. One was the LTT leadership that was dismantled. Second is the international network of the LTT. The international network of the LTT itself cannot be dismantled by the Sri Lankan state because its presence overseas is limited. It is largely the responsibility of other countries, of other governments, and of course working in collaboration and in partnership with their Sri Lankan counterparts. So after the defeat of the LTT in Sri Lanka, three principal nodes have emerged. One is a faction that is led by a man called Father Emmanuel, S.J. Emmanuel, and he heads the Global Tamil Forum. He operates out of London. And that is in many ways the overt organization, the superstructure of the LTT, the open structure that raised money for the LTT, that disseminated propaganda for the LTT. Then another overt structure that has emerged is led by the legal advisor of the LTT. That is a man called Viswanathan Rudrakumaran, and he is currently operating out of New York. He uses the cover of the transnational government of Tamil Eelam. He has self-styled himself as the Prime Minister of Tamil Eelam. But I want to say that his organization's principal mission is to lobby the United Nations, the US government, the European governments. Then we have seen a third entity that has emerged, and that is a man called Perimpanayagam Sivaparan, commonly known as Nediyawan. He was the deputy of Castro. Castro was the man who headed the international network of the LTT. He was based in Wanni, and he committed suicide in the final phase because he didn't want either to surrender or he didn't want to be captured. But Nediyawan, who had studied in Moscow, went to Norway, and he is currently operating what is called the underground infrastructure of the LTT. That is the network that is engaged in human smuggling, credit card, bank and check fraud, and other similar activities. Nediyawan controls that infrastructure, the same infrastructure that was responsible for raising money through criminal means and procuring arms. 95% of the weapons for the LTT came from three blocks of countries. One is it came from Lebanon. The first shipments came from Lebanon. The second batch of weapons came from Eastern Europe, particularly from Bulgaria, the surface-to-air missiles. And I will just mention one particular shipment, that is in 1994, LTT ship transported 50 tons of TNT and 10 tons of RDX from the Black Sea port of Nikolaev from Ukraine. And then we saw, after 97, 95% of the weapons came from North Korea. And this North Korean shipment, most of the money was raised in Canada, some in the United States, some in Western Europe. US response was very strong. I want to say that the FBI did a remarkable job in dismantling 4 LTT cells that existed in the United States. A man called Karunakaran headed that network. His sentencing is just coming up on the 24th of August. And many of these networks were dismantled, and the US played a very important role in arresting the deputy head of procurement of the LTT, Pradipan Tawarasa, in Indonesia. And that gave a lot of information that enabled the Sri Lankan Navy to develop in parallel with its own intelligence, to use that US intelligence to hunt those ships that were operating near the equator and south of the equator and dismantle those ships. So in many ways, there were many countries that worked together to dismantle that LTT network when it was a terrorist group. But today the challenges are different, because today the LTT network has transformed into two areas. One is it has emerged as a propaganda organization that is lobbying diplomats, lobbying non-governmental organizations, lobbying political leaders living in the West who are greedy for votes As you know, politicians are vote driven. So LTT representative under cover of either a human rights organization, humanitarian organization, social organization, cultural organization, will go and say, I can give you so much of votes. Can you make this statement for us in Parliament? And the Western countries, particularly the US, Britain, these are very vulnerable to lobbying. You see. And because of this lobbying capability, we have seen that some politicians have made some statements for their personal and political advantage. So let me make a few concluding remarks. What are the three principal challenges we are facing after the end of the war? One is Sri Lanka needs to develop a very comprehensive communication strategy. The military and the police won the war. But the true reality of what happened in the ground couldn't be projected overseas, because internationally the foreign ministry did not have a capability to counter the misinformation and the disinformation campaign of the LTT. And as a result of that failure, the LTT propaganda was fed into NGOs and into certain politicians and even into some segments of international organizations. And it is imperative today to build that communications infrastructure outside Sri Lanka to counter that. The communications infrastructure in Sri Lanka to counter the LTT was brilliant. In fact, there were many interesting concepts such as Apuvenuwen Api, such concepts that were developed, and people in this country supported the war. There was tremendous recruitment. In fact, that was one of the main factors that led to the defeat of the LTT. But internationally, there was a failure. And as a result, today Sri Lanka has to face the consequences of countering that propaganda. More recently, the Ministry of Defense produced a brilliant film, which is a counter to Channel 4. But I want to say that this needs to be done more frequently and in a more systematic way. And that message has to go out outside Sri Lanka. The second challenge Sri Lanka faces is a diplomatic challenge, because the LTT has now transformed into a propaganda organization operating largely in the international sphere and in the diplomatic sphere. So how does one challenge this? Sri Lankan missions overseas, Sri Lankan associations overseas must become more active. But ministries in Sri Lanka itself should look outside. For example, the information ministry should have a robust communication capability to engaging those elements that may be misled by that propaganda. Similarly, there must be an effort on the part of the government to re-engage certain NGOs. For instance, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should create a diaspora affairs division, should create an NGO advocacy division, should create a post of additional secretary for public diplomacy that will handle this aspect. Because the threat has shifted from Sri Lanka to overseas, and you need new capabilities to manage that. In conclusion, let me also say that there were many admirable things that happened in Sri Lanka. I myself witnessed, as Secretary of Defense mentioned, I went to the rehabilitation centers. I spoke to almost all the senior detainees, mid-level detainees of the LTT. I want to say that those LTT members who fought in the war, they will not return to violence again. Because they know the futility of war. They have suffered war. It is like our soldiers. It is like our officers that fought. They don't want to see war again. But those campaigns that are being waged against Sri Lanka by a very tiny segment of the Sri Lankan community overseas, these people have not seen war. For them it was a game, it was an entertainment. They would say, okay, how many people have been killed in Sri Lanka? It became like a football match for them. So it is very important to engage that community, to invite those people to come to Sri Lanka and visit Sri Lanka and see the unprecedented development in the Northeast. Let me also say that I noticed something that I want to share with you, which was a unique relationship between the detainees and the soldiers. Because our soldiers and the LTT cadres came from the same socio-economic background. And I want to say that on Christmas Day, 2009, I was in one of the rehab centers in Vaunia. And that day, the World Food Program assistance to the detainees came to an end. But the soldiers, they decided to share their ration packs with the LTT detainees. And that day I saw a tremendous friendship developing between those detainees and between our soldiers. Because they ate the same food. Prior to that they were eating noodles that was bland, no taste. So they started to eat the Sri Lankan ration pack, and I want to share with you that the Sri Lankan ration pack is a very quality product. And the detainees themselves felt that there's really no difference between us and them. But they had been fed with so much of propaganda in the past. And this propaganda, simply by meeting others, it was neutralized. So with the LTT threat removed, we are seeing tremendous effort put in for development, but also we are seeing natural reconciliation. And I only hope that the government will invest, other than in communications, developing a communication strategy, international communication strategy, a robust diplomatic campaign, a final aspect of building a mainstream Tamil political leadership. Because the leadership tree was cut not only at the branches, but at the trunk by the LTT. More than 200 Tamil leaders were killed. Nilan Tiruchelvam, Lakshman Kadiragama, most brilliant leaders were killed. So I believe that we are expecting too much for this leadership tree to grow very suddenly. It's only 2 years. But government needs to invest to create a mainstream Tamil leadership. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gunrathan. Now